is Resolute and the Resolute Podcast, where we are discipling and developing men to live with conviction. I am Vince Miller, your host, and today we are discussing being a better husband under the topic, stop building a case against your spouse. Men, welcome back to the program. If this is your first time tuning in, then thanks for joining us. The Resolute Podcast is produced multiple times every week. We have Resolute study guides that go along with this podcast for your men's group, found on the website for members at beresolute.org. Come back often. Feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or in iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. All the links are on the homepage of the website. So let's dive in. Guys, welcome back. We are in a series entitled Being a Better Husband. Over the course of the next few episodes, Keith, TerHaar, and I will be sharing together how we have sharpened our skills as men in our marriage. Keith and I, had started this conversation many months ago. As we got together, we realized every time we sat down together that we talked about our marriage in a very positive light, never in a condescending way toward our wives. And in our work with men, clearly Keith has been a professional licensed marriage counselor for many years. I've counseled men pastorally. And together, looking at nearly 40 years of combined counseling experience with men, we have discovered that men need help with their marriage and that there's issues that they want to have addressed. So we're spending a little bit of time on this topic just to be of service to you. Today, we are looking at the topic of how to stop building a case against your wife as husbands. Keith, thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
And, you talked about this. You actually stirred this topic up for me, and I thought it was profound. Many months ago, you brought this up, and I remember you saying that one of the great pivot points in your marriage was that you learned or had to learn how to stop privately building a case against your wife. I thought this was one of the great discussions that we had, and can you just take a few minutes to explain what that means? What does it mean to stop building a case, or what does it mean to build a case against your wife?
Yeah, well, I think most guys will admit that they have some negative opinion about their wife or some belief about them that has been built as a case against them. And so I think what happens rather naturally is that we decide something about our wife based on something that happened, and it's a negative view. And in order to keep building that case, then we begin to look at them more critically, and we interpret things they're doing as evidence of that belief, right? And so we continue as things happen, as we look at it from that perspective. We keep building that case as if to say, there it is again. Look, it happened again. And so that's what I mean by building that case. And it often comes, I think, when we've maybe been hurt or felt disrespected. And so we have an edge to us toward our wife. And I think that tends to fuel this case building.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that there's some event that catalyzes a thought that we have. And because that thought is very powerful to us, we then interpret everything else through that one thought. So if I have a certain bad thought about my wife, then I look at event A, event B, event C, D, et cetera, all through the lens of that, and I see it as all supporting evidence when it probably isn't always.
Exactly.
Oh man, this is not good. I can see the direction that this is going.
Yeah.
So how do we stop this, Keith? I mean, that makes sense to me. I think I can definitely think of a few situations where I've built a case against my wife, for sure. It maybe before I ask that question, I would assume that the longer we're married, the bigger these cases become. Is that true? Have you seen that in your counseling years?
I would say that, and that's what becomes so dangerous about it, is that it happens and then it can continue for years. And so for me personally, I recognize there's a point in my own marriage where I had started to believe that my wife just didn't really value our marriage. Okay? And when I started to believe that, then anytime she made a decision to do something, instead of pay attention to me, or, instead of go out with me, do something with friends, I started to kind of notice all these things and interpret them as evidence for that belief that I was building against her. So over time, you can imagine that my feelings and my attitude toward her developed, stronger and stronger, and was really a detriment to our relationship.
Okay, so this is really powerful, because I know that I have talked to dozens and dozens and dozens of men who, get 5, 10, 15, 20 years in, and they are now struggling to deal with issues because they've constructed such a massive case against their wife. Deconstructing it is nearly impossible for them because they can only see them one way. And I know many men give up at that point. And I don't want to get into that topic right now that leads to, but I would say that we do this. I mean, we build a case. And unfortunately, you said that there are thoughts and attitudes that go with building this case that become a detriment to how we feel in regard to them. What a powerful impact that can have.
It can be fatal to a marriage.
So how do we deconstruct this case? What do we do to stop building a case against our spouses? This was a pivot point for you. What did you do?
Right. Well, we talked in the past about self-awareness, and you really need to be aware of how you're beginning to do this. And so for me, stopping and really thinking about just being aware of that connection that I kept making. And I think to begin there was to see what I was doing, that I kept interpreting. The harder part, but I think the critical piece, was deciding, right, choosing to say, I'm going to give my wife the benefit of the doubt. In other words, I'm going to choose to interpret what she's doing as having some other reason besides what I was wanting to believe almost, right? It was a negative thing, and yet I was kind of wanting to keep finding evidence, because I think in some ways then it justified my feelings. And at the root of that, I think I saw my own sin in that. And it took me recognizing that and saying, to love my wife well, I really need to think about her positively. And I need to give her the benefit of the doubt that some of these things she's doing are not about not caring about me. They're just other things.
They're just other things, right? Okay, so when we started this topic, I immediately went to something that I say on my mind to build a case against my wife. So this is me being somewhat transparent, I guess. So I sometimes think when we get caught into a bad cycle or an argument or a moment that I don't like that creates some tension in our marriage, I immediately make this statement in my mind. Sometimes it comes out of my mouth. You always.
Sure.
You know what I'm talking about? Okay, so.
Because they always do.
But I think about that statement, right? Like it's such a negative case-building statement. You always? Really? Is that true? Right. And probably not, but I'm assuming that that's a little bit of what we're talking about here. What's going on in our minds, Keith, when we're doing that? What do you think's going on in our minds when we make a statement like "you always"? Are there certain thoughts and attitudes that are going on in our hearts? Are we just spinning and building a case there in a negative way? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do, and it's hard to understand. But I think it tends to be human nature, and maybe it's just easier. It's easier to write someone off than to wrestle with, giving them kind of the benefit of the doubt. It's easier to confirm our own belief and just say, there it is again. She always does that. And somehow, I don't know if there's this kind of a laziness about how we relate to people, but the hard work, again, is stopping and saying, does she really always do that?
Right.
or do I need to be able to say?
Yeah. I love that because you're saying we do carry around these confirmation biases that we have about all kinds of people and sometimes our spouse. As we launched into this topic, I thought of these words from Romans chapter 12. We all know them. They're very well-known verses, but they apply so well in this text. Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. I think this is a profound text that I have never applied to my marriage before for some strange reason. I always apply it to how I think about God, but why can't it be how I think about my spouse? Like, I should be renewing my mind all the time regarding whatever you call it, the confirmation biases, the cases that I build against my wife. Every time I say, you always do this in my mind, that I need to stop that my sacrifice to God is to offer that, right, that thought, and not be conformed to the natural desires of my flesh, but be renewed, right, in my mind, be transformed by that. And it sounds like to me that I need to view my wife as she is the image of God rather than my enemy, right?
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I just think this is a beautiful text to apply to our marriages today. So Keith, come on, let's get really practical with this.
Yeah.
What's something that these guys can do this week to, given this topic, what do we need to be doing or thinking about this week to stop building a case?
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of recognizing those thoughts that are building a case, right? Begin by thinking about and maybe writing down, what are those negative thoughts I have about my wife that maybe I keep trying to build against her? So what is that case that I'm building, right? If I were to go and hang out with my buddies and gossip about my wife, what would I probably say? She spends too much money, or she does this or that. Recognize where you're doing that. And then I think to that transformation process of saying, how do I really want to think about my wife? How do I want to speak of her to others in an honoring way? And write those down. And in some ways, what we're doing is we're trying to do a gratitude exercise. Sometimes I'll recommend a gratitude journal. Is write about all the things you love about your wife.
Yeah.
It's a great way to begin renewing your mind.
That's fantastic, Keith. We need to be told to never say something negative about our spouse. I mean, the calling our wives the ball and chain, when we're out with our friends, she's always spending so much money, et cetera, et cetera. There's a list of negative things that unfortunately we sometimes say. I know we have never said that, which that's why I've enjoyed our conversations, but I think so many men get caught up in that. And I hear what you're saying. A call to action would be very simple. Stop doing those things and start seeing them a different way, and look at the beauty and the gratitude in them, the things that we're really thankful for them as they interact with our lives. So, wow, Keith, this is great. Well, guys, that's the show. Thanks for listening. I really hope you enjoyed our time today, because I've enjoyed spending it with you, and Keith, you as well. We hope that you will pass along this podcast to other men you know. Just head to the website to share this, or simply share the feed. So guys, I love you. Get off the bench and get into the game. And join us next time for another edition of the Resolute Podcast.